You expect me to put her in the cockpit of a $2 billion prototype? She looks like she'd get lost on the way to the mess hall, the words, dripping with the casual cruelty of unchecked authority, echoed off the polished concrete floor of the hangar. The assembled ground crew and engineers shifted, a collective wince rippling through the crowd of khaki and blue. A few of the younger airmen, those still mistaking arrogance for strength, offered a nervous, sycophantic chuckle that died almost instantly in the cavernous, sterile space. General Marcus Thorne, a man whose presence was as subtle as a hammer, stood with his hands on his hips, his barrel chest puffed out, glaring at the woman in the ill-fitting flight suit. She, Major Evelyn Reed, offered no reaction. Her focus remained entirely on the datapad in her hands, her thumb methodically scrolling through pre-flight checklists with a practiced, almost serene, economy of motion. She did not look up. She did not flinch. Her silence was a wall against which his contempt shattered into meaningless noise. But when the project's lead scientist, an old civilian with eyes that had seen more failures and triumphs than the general had seen parades, glanced at the way she held her body, the perfect, relaxed posture of someone who has spent a lifetime mastering the razor's edge of controlled chaos, a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He knew. The general saw a librarian. The scientist saw a weapon. If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume, but in results, type competence below. The hangar itself was a cathedral dedicated to speed, a climate-controlled sanctuary carved out of the searing Nevada desert. Outside, the heat shimmered above the endless tarmac, a visible distortion of reality. Inside, under the stark white glare of industrial lighting, the X-77 Wraith sat on its landing gear like a predator from another world. It wasn't a plane. It was a shard of obsidian, a blade of impossible angles and radar-absorbent materials that seemed to drink the light from the air. Its very existence was a secret whispered only in the most secure chambers of the Pentagon. It was designed to fly higher and faster than anything ever built, a ghost that could touch the edge of space and return before an enemy even knew it had been watched. And General Thorne, commander of this bleeding-edge facility, saw its pilot as nothing more than a clerical error, a box-ticking exercise in diversity from a distant bureaucracy that understood nothing of the warrior spirit. He turned his tirade on Colonel Davies, the long-suffering liaison officer. "Look at her, Colonel. Is this some kind of social experiment? We are safeguarding the single most advanced aerospace asset on the planet, and you bring me a pilot who looks like she weighs 100 pounds soaking wet. What's her call sign, Bookworm?" "The men who fly for me are killers, Davies. They have fire in their eyes." "She has bifocals." He gestured dismissively toward Major Reed, who was now crouching to inspect the thermal ceramic tiles along the Wraith's chine, her gloved fingers tracing the seams with a surgeon's delicacy. She was oblivious to him, not out of disrespect, but because in her world, the only thing that mattered was the machine and the mission. The general's words were static, irrelevant data that her mind had already filtered out as non-essential for flight. A grizzled master sergeant, a man who had serviced everything from F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam to F-22 Raptors over Iraq. Watch her work. He saw the way her eyes moved, not just looking but seeing, analyzing, cross-referencing 1,000 mental schematics with the physical reality before her. He had seen that look before in the eyes of the legends, the pilots whose names were spoken in hushed tones. It was the look of absolute, unshakable competence. He caught the eye of the old scientist, and they shared a silent, knowing nod. They were keepers of a secret the general was too blind to see. The crisis, when it came, did not arrive with a warning siren or a klaxon. It came as a quiet, frantic voice over a secure channel in the base's command center, a place of hushed intensity and glowing screens known as the Mole Hole. A KH-14 Archangel reconnaissance satellite, a $1 trillion eye in the sky, had suffered a catastrophic cascade failure in its guidance and power systems. Tumbling, dead, and utterly unresponsive, it was now a 3-ton piece of orbital debris on a decaying trajectory. Its projected impact zone was a wide, terrifying slash across the western United States, including several populated areas. Worse, its data core, containing intelligence that could destabilize entire regions, was hardened against conventional reentry burnup. The self-destruct command had failed. It had to be physically intercepted and obliterated above 300,000 feet, an altitude where the atmosphere was too thin for any conventional fighter or interceptor to operate. The window was 97 minutes. Panic, a cold and professional kind, began to settle into the room. Scenarios were run, assets were reviewed, and every single time, the simulation returned the same answer: mission failure. No existing aircraft could reach the target's altitude and velocity in time. Except one. In the hangar, General Thorne was in the middle of officially grounding Major Reed, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. "So you see, Colonel, it's a matter of risk mitigation. I'm not willing to—" His words were cut short by the frantic arrival of an operations officer, his face pale. He handed a tablet to the general. Thorne's face went from ruddy anger to ashen gray as he read the data. Every eye in the hangar was on him. The fate of millions and a national security disaster of epic proportions rested on a decision he had to make in the next 30 seconds. He looked at the impossible aircraft. He looked at the unassuming woman who was its designated pilot. The universe had called his bluff. Trapped by a crisis only the person he had just publicly humiliated could solve, he uttered the three most difficult words of his career, his voice barely a whisper. "Get it done." Major Reed showed no sign of vindication, no flicker of triumph. She simply nodded once, crisply, to Colonel Davies. "Understood, sir." Her preparation was a silent, fluid ballet of practiced efficiency. She walked toward the Wraith not with a swagger, but with the quiet, determined gait of a master craftsman approaching their workbench. The ground crew, now moving with a desperate, focused energy, swarmed the aircraft, pulling chocks and disconnecting umbilicals. Reed ascended the boarding ladder, her movements economical and precise. Inside the cockpit, a space no larger than a coffin, she settled into the ejection seat, and her entire demeanor seemed to shift. She was no longer a small woman in a large hangar. She was the central nervous system of the most complex machine ever created. Her hands, which the general had implicitly mocked as weak, moved over the control panels with a blur of practiced familiarity. Switches were flipped, buttons were pressed, and screens flickered to life, reflecting a constellation of data in her helmet's visor. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Each action flowed into the next, a symphony of muscle memory honed by thousands of hours in simulators and classified prototypes. In the command center, her voice came over the comms, a calm, steady alto that cut through the rising tension in the room. "Mission Control, this is Ghost. Pre-flight complete. All systems are green. Ready for immediate launch," the call sign, Ghost, hung in the air. For General Thorne, it was the first clue that he was dealing with something far beyond his comprehension. The name was a legend in the Black Ops community, a pilot spoken of in whispers, a myth credited with feats of airmanship that defied the laws of physics. He had always assumed Ghost was a man. As the Wraith's engines ignited with a low, guttural hum that quickly rose to a ground-shaking roar, the general gripped the console in front of him, his knuckles white. The impossible pilot was about to fly an impossible mission, and all he could do was watch. The takeoff was not a flight. It was an act of controlled violence, a brutal rejection of gravity. The X-77 Wraith leaped from the runway, its twin scramjet engines gulping down the desert air and converting it into pure, unrestrained power. It didn't climb. It vanished, punching a hole in the sky and leaving behind only a deafening thunderclap that rattled the windows of the command center. On the main tracking screen, the Wraith's icon was a vertical line, an almost instantaneous ascent that seemed to defy logic. The G-forces inside the cockpit were immense, enough to crush an ordinary person into unconsciousness. But Major Reed was not an ordinary person. Her breathing was rhythmic, her body conditioned to the strain, her mind a placid lake of focus in a hurricane of physical stress. Her voice over the comms remained impossibly serene. Passing 100,000 feet, all systems nominal. Transitioning to internal oxidizer, The roar of the atmosphere-breathing engine ceased, replaced by the eerie, silent thrust of the rocket motor. The Wraith was now a spaceship. Outside her canopy, the blue of the sky had deepened to an indigo, then to the pure, star-dusted black of the void. Below her, the gentle curve of the earth was a breathtaking spectacle of blue and white, a fragile marble suspended in nothingness. General Thorne stared, mesmerized and horrified, at the telemetry data pouring onto the screens. Her heart rate was as steady as a sleeping man's. Her fuel consumption was a fraction of what the simulations had predicted. She was flying the aircraft not by the book, but by a deeper, more intuitive understanding of its limits, pushing it into a performance envelope the engineers hadn't even known existed. Target acquired, she reported, her voice unchanged. Closing for intercept. Engaging weapon systems. On the screen, two tiny dots were converging at an impossible speed. One was the tumbling satellite, the other the Ghost. She wasn't just flying. She was conducting a surgical strike on the edge of space. The weapon was an experimental solid-state laser, a lance of pure energy that required the pilot to hold the craft in a perfectly stable firing solution for a full 3 seconds, an eternity at hypersonic speeds. The general watched, his mouth agape. He saw the flight path she was taking, a parabolic arc that bled off just enough velocity to stabilize, a maneuver so precise and dangerous it was known only in theoretical papers. It was called the Reed Escalator, and she was executing it flawlessly. A single, silent pulse of brilliant green light flashed across the tactical display. The satellite's icon vanished, replaced by an expanding cloud of vaporized debris. A beat of stunned silence filled the command center, broken only by the quiet hum of electronics. Then Eve's voice, as calm as if she were ordering coffee. Target neutralized. Returning to base. The return was, in its own way, even more astonishing than the ascent. To conserve the last vestiges of her fuel for final approach, Major Reed performed a completely unpowered descent from the edge of space. The Wraith became a $2 billion glider, a carbon fiber brick falling through the sky. A dead-stick landing in a conventional fighter is one of the most difficult and dangerous maneuvers a pilot can attempt. A dead-stick landing in a hypersonic craft with a glide ratio of a stone was considered a suicidal fantasy. Yet on the screens in the command center, they watched her do it. She used the atmosphere itself as her instrument, bleeding off speed in a series of perfectly executed S-turns, managing energy and altitude with a finesse that seemed supernatural. General Thorne could only shake his head, the last remnants of his arrogance sandblasted away by the sheer, undeniable magnitude of her skill. He had not just been wrong. He had been profoundly, fundamentally ignorant. As the Wraith's icon lined up perfectly with the runway, a secure video channel chimed, demanding attention on the main screen. The face that appeared was stern, etched with the immense pressure of high command. It was Admiral Garrett Vance, a 4-star officer from Naval Special Warfare Command, the shadowy figure who oversaw the entire multi-service Special Project Division. His eyes, cold and piercing, scanned the room before landing on General Thorne. The general, a man used to commanding respect, snapped to attention so fast he almost stumbled. The Admiral wasted no time on pleasantries. His voice was a low growl of controlled fury that crackled through the speakers. General Thorne, I trust you've had a satisfactory, if unscheduled, demonstration of my pilot's capabilities? Thorne stammered, his face a blotchy red. Admiral, there was a situation. I was not fully briefed on the majors. Vance cut him off with a slice of his hand. You were briefed that she was the pilot. That should have been enough. Colonel Davies, he commanded, his gaze shifting. Pull up Major Reed's complete, unredacted service jacket. Put on the main screen. And Thorne, he added, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, I want you to read it. Aloud. Now, a new window opened on the screen, displaying a wall of text and insignia that silenced the room. The colonel, with a grim sense of justification, began to scroll. General Thorne, his voice trembling, began to read. Major Evelyn Reed. Call sign, Ghost. He paused, the name catching in his throat. The narrator's voice seemed to take over, overlaying the general's faltering recitation with the cold, hard facts of a legendary career. Unit 7 Special Projects Wing, designation ST-4 Phantoms. A unit so secret, its existence was officially denied. Flight hours, 4,112. Over 2,500 of those hours logged in experimental and hypersonic craft, more than any other 5 pilots combined. Combat sorties, classified. Awards, Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 silver oak leaf clusters, indicating at least 16 separate acts of heroism. The Air Medal with Valor Device. The Purple Heart. The NASA Exceptional Service Medal. The list scrolled on, a breathtaking testament to a life lived at the absolute peak of human performance. Notations: lead test pilot for the Aurora program, the mythical successor to the state Route 71. Chief architect of the flight control systems for the Helios solar-powered atmospheric satellite. Sole survivor of the Project Chimera disaster, a suborbital incident where she successfully landed a craft with an 87% control surface failure and a complete loss of primary avionics after a micrometeorite strike. The final line on the screen was a simple, chilling designation. Status: Tier 1 National Strategic Asset. The room was utterly still. The men and women in that command center were looking at the service record of not just a pilot, but a living legend, a figure whose accomplishments were the stuff of myth. They had just witnessed a chapter of that myth being written in real time. The general fell silent, unable to continue, his face a mask of utter humiliation. He had not just insulted a major. He had berated a national treasure. Admiral Vance let the silence hang in the air for a long, punishing moment, allowing the full weight of the general's catastrophic misjudgment to settle over the room. Then he spoke again, his voice like chips of ice. "General, that girl you wanted to kick off your base because she didn't look the part has more time above the Kármán line than you have in a command chair. She didn't just write the book on hypersonic energy management. She is the book. The flight profile she just executed, the one your own engineers have on file as theoretically impossible under combat stress, that's her signature. It's called the Reed Escalator. She developed it 6 years ago to save a failing prototype over the Indian Ocean. It's now the baseline for all emergency descent profiles in our program." He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes boring into Thorne. "Her job today was a simple systems check. Your job was to facilitate that test and stay out of her way. Instead, you chose to indulge in cheap, petty prejudice. You publicly demeaned a fellow officer. You compromised the morale of your own personnel. And by delaying her pre-flight, you put the entire mission to save the Archangel satellite at risk. You, sir, failed in every conceivable way a commander can fail." The Admiral's expression softened for a fraction of a second as he turned his attention back to the liaison officer. "Colonel Davies, when Major Reed is wheels down and out of that cockpit, I want you to convey my personal commendation for her superlative performance under extreme and unnecessary pressure. Then, you will ensure that every single man and woman on that flight line is present to render her the salute she has earned 1,000 times over. Is that clear?" "Yes, Admiral. Crystal clear, sir," Davies replied, his voice ringing with pride. The Admiral's gaze swung back to Thorne, the warmth vanishing instantly. "As for you, General," he said, his voice flat and final, "your command of this installation is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Pack your personal effects. AC 130 transport will be on your tarmac in 2 hours to fly you to your new assignment. Director of Logistics and Inventory at the Davis-Monthan Boneyard. Maybe spending your days counting old, retired fuselages will teach you that what's on the outside rarely reflects the power of the engine within." Vance out. The screen went black, leaving behind a silence more profound and damning than any shout could ever be. General Marcus Thorne stood frozen for a moment, a statue of broken pride, before he slowly, mechanically, began to unpin the command insignia from his collar. The story spread not like wildfire, but like a hypersonic shockwave. It traveled through secure comms channels, encrypted emails, and the ever-reliable military gossip network known as the Barracks Telegraph. Before Major Reed's wraith had even cooled on the tarmac, the tale of the unassuming pilot, the arrogant general, and the Admiral's brutal, televised takedown was already becoming legend. At Nellis Air Force Base, fighter pilots in the officers' club spoke of the ghost touch in hushed, reverent tones. At the Pentagon, senior officials who knew of Reed's work nodded grimly. It was about time the operational world understood the caliber of the assets they commanded. The control tower recordings from the command center were immediately classified at the highest level, but that only added to the myth. Transcripts, likely fabricated but containing the essential truth of the events, began to circulate in the darker corners of military forums online. The Reed escalator became the new bogeyman in advanced flight simulators, an impossible standard that washed out even the most talented pilots. The legend was cemented. The ripple effect of that single morning was remaking reputations and reinforcing a timeless lesson. 2 hours later, just as the Admiral had promised, a drab, 4-engine C-130 Hercules rumbled onto the far side of the airfield. Former General Thorne, now in a simple uniform stripped of all command insignia, walked alone across the shimmering tarmac. There was no honor guard, no farewell ceremony, no one to see him off but a lone airman handling his luggage. He didn't look angry anymore, just tired and hollowed out. His shoulders, once perpetually squared with authority, were slumped in defeat. He had built a career on projecting an image of strength, and it had all been dismantled in 90 seconds by a quiet woman and a clear-eyed admiral. As he boarded the noisy, utilitarian transport plane for his career's final, ignominious flight to an eternity of paperwork in Arizona, he had become what he feared most: irrelevant. He was no longer a commander. He was a cautionary tale, a lesson taught to new lieutenants about the fatal flaw of assumption. In the brightly lit hangar, the atmosphere was entirely different. As Major Reed descended the ladder from the Wraith's cockpit, helmet under her arm, the entire assembly of ground crew, engineers, technicians, and officers, over 100 personnel, snapped to attention as one. Following Colonel Davies' lead, 100 arms raised in a sharp, perfectly synchronized salute. It was a gesture of profound, spontaneous respect, an honor guard of the common soldier for their quiet champion. Eve, a major, was being rendered a level of deference usually reserved for a visiting head of state. She seemed momentarily taken aback, the first flicker of emotion she had shown all day. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. She returned the salute crisply, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the crew, acknowledging their hard work. There was no gloating, no I told you so. She was, as always, the consummate professional. She immediately walked, not to the colonel for a formal debrief, but to the master sergeant in charge of the maintenance crew. "Sergeant," she began, her voice low and technical, "I detected a harmonic vibration in the port side fuel pump during the terminal phase of the burn. It was about 0.5% outside of optimal parameters. I've flagged the telemetry, but I want your team to take a physical look before we clear her for the next flight." She was already back at work, focused on the machine, on the details on the next mission. She deflected the crew's awestruck congratulations and questions about the intercept with simple, direct answers about thermal tile stress and avionics feedback. Later, a young female airman, a junior avionics technician, approached her hesitantly, holding a data pad. "Ma'am, Major Reed, I was looking at the energy readings from the laser array. I don't understand how you managed to get a clean firing solution with that much atmospheric distortion." Instead of dismissing her, Eve stopped, took the data pad, and spent the next 20 minutes patiently walking the young woman through the complex physics, sketching equations on the screen with her finger. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a mentor, a teacher, passing on her philosophy of quiet, meticulous competence to the next generation. On the wall of the command center, where a portrait of General Thorne had once hung, there was now a new addition. It was a high-resolution print of the final frame of telemetry from the Archangel satellite, showing the perfect, symmetrical energy signature of the Wraith's laser just before impact. Beneath it, a simple, newly engraved brass plaque read, "The Ghost's Touch. Perfection is the standard." Months later, The culture at the remote desert base had undergone a seismic shift. The X-77 program, buoyed by the invaluable real-world combat data from Reed's unscheduled test flight, was years ahead of schedule. The Wraith, once a temperamental prototype, was now a reliable and terrifyingly capable asset in the nation's arsenal. The new base commander was Brigadier General Anna Castillo, a sharp, no-nonsense leader from the intelligence community who had followed Reed's career for years. One of her first actions was to make the story of that fateful day a mandatory part of the orientation briefing for all new personnel. The tale of the day the Admiral grounded a general was no longer just barracks gossip. It was institutional doctrine, a powerful, officially sanctioned lesson on the critical importance of looking past the uniform to see the warrior within. Assumptions based on gender, size, or demeanor were not just discouraged. They were treated as a critical failure of leadership. The standard at the base was no longer about looking the part, but about being able to do the job to the highest possible degree of excellence. Competence, demonstrated and proven, was the only currency that mattered. Major Reed, the quiet catalyst for this revolution, remained unchanged. She continued her work, pushing the boundaries of flight, testing new systems, and always taking the time to teach. Her call sign, Ghost, was now spoken with a unique kind of reverence, the name of a living myth who walked the halls and worked among them. She was a constant, silent reminder that the most powerful force in the world is not a loud voice or a chest full of medals, but the unwavering calm of a professional who has mastered their craft so completely that they no longer have anything to prove to anyone but themselves. True strength is a quiet thing. It is not found in the volume of a command, but in the precision of an action. It does not reside in the arrogance of assumption, but in the humility of constant preparation. It is the deafening silence in a cockpit on the edge of space, the calm and steady hand on a control stick in the midst of a crisis, the deep well of knowledge and experience that requires no announcement because its results speak for themselves. General Thorne believed strength was a performance, a projection of power designed to intimidate and command. He was a hollow vessel, loud with the echo of his own ego. Major Reed understood that strength was a state of being, an internal fortress built of discipline, study, and 1,000 silent hours spent perfecting her craft. Her legacy was not written in the headlines she avoided or the commendations she filed away. It was written in the sky, in the impossible arc of a flight that saved lives. It was etched into the minds of every person on that base who learned to see with new eyes, to value substance over style. It lived on in the young airmen whom she took the time to teach, who would one day become a leader herself, carrying forward the lesson that respect is not demanded by a rank, but earned by competence. True legacy is not the story you leave behind, but the standard that continues forward in your absence. Evelyn Reed was a ghost in the machine, an invisible force who changed everything not by what she said, but by what she did. She proved that in the final analysis, the world is not shaped by the loud voices of insecure men, but by the quiet, steady hands of the competent. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.